Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Planning Committee of Wokingham Borough Council on the 9th of November 2022. This meeting is being held as a hybrid meeting with committee members present in the room this evening, whilst some officers are attending the meeting in person and some connecting via Microsoft Teams. The meeting is being live streamed on YouTube. My name is Councillor Andrew Mickleborough, and I will chair the meeting as the chair has given her apologies. The Planning Committee is consisted of 9 elected borough councillors who are supported by a variety of professional officers. This is a quasi-judicial committee with formal set procedures which must be adhered to. Firstly, the planning officer will present the application, and then only those speakers who have registered to speak will be invited to address the committee. No one else, including borough councillors, town and parish councillors, agents, applicants, objectors or supporters are permitted to address the committee, ask questions or disrupt the meeting. Everyone has had the opportunity to comment on each application through the consultation process. Please note that there is a strict time limit of 3 minutes per category of speaker, those being town and parish councils, objectors, supporters, and those borough members affected by the application, except for item 51, where a separate agreement has been reached. Members of the committee are more impressed by the quality of what you say rather than how long you speak for. But above all, please stay within the time limits. Following the registered speakers, members of the committee will discuss and debate each application and seek clarification from the council's professional planning officers in order to try and reach a decision. The decision reached by the committee may or may not agree with the recommendation by the presenting case officer. Finally, it is the committee's responsibility to determine any valid planning application presented before it using current national and local planning policies and relevant decisions of the relevant planning inspectorate. Our role is not to suggest alternatives to applications, nor to consider whether they are a good idea, whether they are needed, whether they are too costly, or whether there are alternative uses of the site or more suitable uses of land elsewhere. If you are joining us remotely, please ensure that your camera is switched on only when you are speaking and that your microphone is unmuted only when you are speaking. Thank you. So we move to agenda item 46. Apologies, Callum.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Apologies submitted from councillors Rochelle Shepherd-Debay and John Kaiser.
Thank you. Agenda item 47, minutes of the previous meeting. I have one update from these minutes, but before discussing this, do any members wish to propose any corrections to those minutes? Thank you. Can I have a proposer that these minutes are accepted as a true and accurate record of the meeting held on the 12th of October? Thank you, Stephen. And a seconder? Thank you, Rebecca. I will sign these minutes after the meeting. I have one matter arising from the minutes. In that meeting, Councillor Smith requested that the planning team consider provision of supplementary guidance in relation to carbon reduction savings and energy efficiency standards. The Chair and I have discussed this with officers, and it has been agreed that they will provide a written response to this prior to the next meeting. Does anybody have any further matters arising from those minutes? Thank you. Item 48. Sorry?
Just need to vote.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, I do beg your pardon. Yes, so we've had a proposer and a seconder. All those in favour of accepting those minutes? Thank you, that is unanimous. Item 48, any declarations of interest? No, thank you. Item 49, any applications to be deferred? Any withdrawn items?
None, Chair.
Thank you. So we move now on to agenda item 50, application number 220663, land south of Old Bath Road. And the case officer is Andrew Chugg. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Item number 50. This is an outline application for the erection of 57 dwellings suitable for older persons accommodation following demolition of 3 existing properties. Access, layout, scale and appearance is to be considered. The proposed units will be self-contained C3 residential accommodation limited to occupation by the over 60s. No significant care facilities will be provided on site, as it is intended that future occupants would lead an independent lifestyle as much as possible. The application is located within settlement in the limited development location of Sonning, hence making a sustainable location for the redevelopment of housing. The site is currently occupied by 3 large detached dwellings, the Lawns, the Range and Red Lodge. Previous permissions on this site include a redevelopment of 6 large detached dwellings and an almost identical proposal for 57 plats for older persons accommodation, which was approved last year under application 201-833, the reserved matters for which has also subsequently been approved. The current proposal would again deliver 57 private flats within 3 blocks in the same manner as the extant permission as shown here. However, this latest application has been supported by a financial viability assessment, which identifies that the scheme is now unviable to support any financial contributions towards affordable housing. The financial viability assessment has been independently reviewed by the Council's consultant valuer, who concurs that the scheme is no longer able to remain financially viable with the affordable housing contribution previously secured. Notwithstanding the identified viability shortfall, the applicant has agreed a nominal financial contribution of £100,000 towards affordable housing and, importantly, a deferred payment mechanism which will allow scope to secure additional contributions towards affordable housing in the borough should the viability for the scheme improve in the future. The Council's Housing Policy Officer and the Consultant Valuer are in agreement with this approach. Paragraph 57 of the NPPF outlines the tests which should be met when seeking planning obligations, and as outlined in the financial viability section of the officer's report, the NPPF requires that all contributions are fairly and reasonably related to scale and kind to the development, and hence the local planning authority has an obligation to consider the financial viability of schemes where shortfalls are identified. In light of the submitted FVA, financial viability appraisal, the following independent professional advice on this submission: the applicant's proposal is deemed reasonable proposition in the context of the general housing objectives of the NPPF. The proposal incorporates the same architectural approach to the external elevations as per the approved reserved matters application 213022. For example, the white rendered sections, header courses and black painted timber framing on blocks A, B and C, as shown here, will help better articulate these larger elevations and suitably reduce their perceived mass and bulk. While the principle of the development has already been established by the extant permission on site, all the potential impacts of the proposed scheme have been again assessed in the officer's report. Moreover, there are substantial benefits associated with the proposed delivery of 57 dwellings that should be given significant weight in the planning balance. In respect of potential impacts on the character of the area, residential amenity, highways, flooding, trees, ecology and archaeology, the proposal is acceptable in these respects, subject to adherence to the recommended conditions outlined at Appendix 1 on page 41 of your agenda. Compared to the extant permission, more robust conditions have also been agreed with the applicant in respect of potential noise impacts to and from the development, strengthened tree protection measures and sustainable surface water management. Hence, the application is recommended for approval, subject to conditions provided at Appendix 1 and the Section 106 heads of terms highlighted on page 15 of the officer's report.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, a representative of Sonning Parish Council, Councillor Trefor Fisher, was registered to speak on this application, but is now unable to do so in person or virtually. The Parish Council has requested that Councillor Fisher's statement be read out tonight, and I have received advice from officers that it is permissible for me to do so. So on behalf of Sonning Parish Council, Councillor Fisher says, "Good evening, Chairman and members of the committee. The members of Sonning Parish Council are disappointed in the continuing promotion of this site for 57 flats. Many Sonning residents remain very strongly opposed to this proposed development for a variety of reasons. The location remains of dubious sustainability. Access to and from the site remains dangerous for both pedestrians and cyclists due to the busy surrounding roads and fast-moving traffic. The so-called good bus service continues to provide complaints to the Parish Council, including many in the past week. Though within 30 minutes walking distance from the centre of Woodley, this route remains very hazardous as it involves the crossing of the railway bridge with no pathway. The planning officer at the committee for the previous application, 201833, stated that the adjacent building was a very significant building and therefore in part formed the context for the acceptance of the proposals. Sonning Parish Council has always regarded this policy as severely flawed. Site 5S00008 is being promoted by WBC in the draft local plan update. This is directly adjacent to the south of the site being considered here. Does this mean that another 3 blocks of flats could be built on site 8? Whilst these concerns remain, the big difference between this application and the previous one for this site, number 201833, relates to the contribution towards affordable housing. The extant approval includes a Section 106 agreement in which the developer has to pay WBC the sum of over £1.6 million towards affordable housing in the borough. The planning application now being considered has reduced this amount by 94% to £100,000 due to the lack of viability of the project. This barely represents 1/6 of the purchase price of only one of the 57 flats to be built. Whilst the clause states that this may be increased, this is unlikely due to falling house prices and rising materials and labour costs. The contribution towards affordable housing was clearly a major factor to the committee members when the previous application was approved in March 2021. The meeting minutes indicate one member saying that he welcomed provision of 40% affordable housing, though he stated that he would prefer to have seen it provided on site. Another commented that the scheme met affordable housing requirements. Others discussed the topic in a similar fashion. If the contribution to affordable housing was so important last year, why is it not important now? Sonning Parish Council had been shown evidence suggesting that the site is already being marketed for sale as coming within with planning permission granted. Whilst not a planning issue, this does have some bearing on viability. And I'm afraid I must stop there as we have run out of time. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Tim Burden, the agent. Tim, if you could come to the table and switch on the microphone by just pressing the button. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, members, thank you for the opportunity to address you this evening. I'd firstly like to thank your officers for bringing this proposal to committee with a recommendation for approval, following its thorough consideration through the application process. The officers' report before you has considered the merits of the proposal in some detail, so I'll focus on setting out the differences between this scheme and the previously approved scheme, and the reasons for submitting this current application. As you've heard, outline planning permission and a reserved matters approval have already been granted for an earlier iteration of the scheme. The outline permission secured policy compliant commuted financial contributions towards affordable housing and employment skills via the Section 106 agreement. However, at that time, concern was expressed to officers regarding the viability of the scheme. Since these previous applications were approved, as you'll be aware, the cost of materials and financing have increased significantly alongside downward pressures in the market more widely. As such, and in order to allow for its robust consideration by the Council, a fresh application was submitted. As explained by your officer in paragraphs 88 to 98 of his report, a financial viability appraisal has been reviewed by the Council's independent consultants, have concluded that the site could not sustain a policy-compliant financial contribution towards affordable housing. Nonetheless, our clients have offered a minimum upfront affordable housing contribution of £100,000 to be subject to a late-stage review and subject to a local planning permission being secured. Your officers consider that this is reasonable and justified, and we consider it accords with the flexibility facilitated by policy CP5 of your core strategy and the Council's 2013 Affordable Housing SPD. Turning to the scheme itself, visually the current proposal is nearly identical to the one already approved, with alterations being predominantly internal, along with the addition of 4 parking spaces. Landscaping is reserved for consideration at a later stage. As concluded previously, the proposal will meet the needs of a specific sector of the community through the provision of bespoke older persons accommodation on a site within the settlement boundary. The principle of development has therefore been accepted by the Council on this site. Since the submission of the application, the scheme has been amended and we've worked positively with officers to respond to comments received from both statutory consultees and members of the public. Consequently, there are no outstanding objections from the Council's internal consultees. As set out in the officer's report, the proposal accords fully with the standards contained within your design guide, demonstrating sufficient back-to-back distances and protecting residential amenity. To further minimise the potential impacts on neighbouring properties, blank gable end walls have been avoided where possible and site boundaries will be reinforced. The proposal has also been designed to ensure that buildings are set back from the rear boundary, allowing for the introduction of robust structural landscaping on the settlement boundary, reinforcing the existing tree belt, which will be retained alongside existing mature hedgerows on other boundaries with neighbouring dwellings. Indeed, the layout's been configured to ensure...
Excuse me, Mr. Burden, I must ask you to...
No worries at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Ward Member, Councillor Michael Firmager. Thank you, Michael.
Hello there. Good. Excellent. Good evening, Deputy Chairman and members of the Planning Committee. When this site previously came up under application number 201833, I objected for the following reasons of it was out of character with the area. This is overdevelopment of an already congested area, especially with the side road to the proposed development already providing access with the Rams Rugby Club. This side road and other surrounding roads will be ever more chaotic on match days. The access from here will be onto the A4, which is extremely busy and indeed a very dangerous road. There are infrequent bus links, which is quite crucial when we're talking about elderly people, and I don't want to be patronising. And this site is a long way from local amenities such as Charleville, especially if walking, plus Sonning Railway Bridge, as Trevor Phillips, who sadly is not well, that's why he's not here, mentioned there is no pavement when accessing Woodley and accessing anywhere else. There needs to be motorised transport to get to and from the area, especially if walking is difficult. This counters Woking Borough Council's efforts to reduce CO2 emissions. I can see there'll be no change to these concerns that I raised earlier on. I strongly support the views of Sonning Parish Council by the speech by Trevor Fisher and Theresa May as a local MP, and indeed others, including local residents, in objecting to this flawed and highly unpopular application. The application is being submitted because this development would have been unviable, providing the original level of affordable housing. According to the officer just mentioned tonight, and a little bit different from the gentleman behind me, the developers are making a contribution of 100,000, not the minimum, according to the officer, which is derisory. I would state this application is still unviable. Indeed, it is unsustainable and will lead to great congestion and higher levels of parking, causing inconvenience to residents. This application must be refused. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Firmager. So we now go to questions from members of the committee. At the moment, Stephen has indicated a wish to speak. David? Anybody else at this stage? Wayne, thank you. Thank you. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd like to start with some of the points that Michael was making about his concerns about the application. Those clearly reflect local residents' concerns and the parish council's concerns. And I have a lot of sympathy with the points made. However, we are in the position where this application has effectively been given a green light by previous planning history. Outline planning permission and reserved matters have both been approved on a scheme that is essentially the same in terms of built form. An appeal inspector, were the committee to follow what Michael's requesting and refuse this application, an appeal inspector would immediately say, what is different between this application and the one that your planning committee approved only last year? And in terms of built form, we would be struggling to find any material difference. The only real difference is in the affordable housing provision. And that clearly is an area where it's deeply disappointing, to put it mildly, that it's not any longer being proposed to provide the level of contribution that was offered when the original application was approved. We desperately need affordable and particularly social rental housing in the borough, and to find that this is effectively being not provided through this application at the level of commuted sum that we hoped for is very, very disappointing. However, we have to accept that there's been an independent assessment of viability. This isn't simply the developer saying we can't afford it. There's been a great deal of careful work done to try and assess whether the developer's claims can be substantiated. And when you've had an independent reviewer look at this and say that that is a fair point, then we are not in a position as a planning committee to be able to disregard that. We can't offer expert testimony that would counter that. So whatever the reservations we may have, or whatever sympathy we may have had with the points that Michael's made and Trevor Fisher made via the chair, I don't think as a planning committee we have any option but to approve this application, given the planning history and given the expert testimony on viability.
Thank you, Councillor Conway. David?
Thank you, Chair. I largely agree with what Councillor Conway has said, with one important difference. This is clearly no different from the previous application in terms of built form. And I think I agree we'd be on difficult ground opposite an inspector were we to reject the application on that basis. But it clearly is not meeting the previous application in terms of policy CP5, which is the provision for affordable housing. I can understand readily that business and market situations have changed since this application first came forward, and that CP5 does allow for some flexibility. But with the greatest respect to Councillor Conway, I think we can perhaps challenge a statement that says this has moved from 1.6 million to £100,000 as a reflection of the difference in viability. In my maths, and I admit I'm no great mathematician, the 1.6 million represented around about £28,000 per dwelling. Now, I don't know what the price per flat in Sonning is, but I suspect £28,000 is not a massively high percentage. There must surely be some middle ground between that figure and a figure that now represents less than £2,000 per dwelling, which is insignificant in terms of the price of a dwelling in Sonning. So although the independent assessment says what it says, I'd like to sort of come back to the officer concerned and say, is there no better ground than that almost complete reduction of the social housing levy for this application?
Who would like to respond to that? Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Chair. As you can kind of gather, we haven't taken this at face value. We've gone externally, got professional valuers to have a look at this and scrutinise what the applicant has put in terms of the financial viability appraisal. There'll never be absolute agreement between parties on kind of financial viability because it's a very kind of detailed, lengthy process. I'm not a specialist on that, but the headline terms really are that the applicant is suggesting it's kind of 3 million kind of in the red, but our assessment and our viability experts assessment is that it's more like 1.3 million in the red. So even in that respect, it's unable to make the kind of financial contributions towards affordable housing.
Dave, would you like to pursue that further?
Only an observation, Chair, but it does seem to me that, again, we all recognise the changes in the condition of the market since it was put in. But if that scale of change is reflected in the numbers you've just given us there, Andrew, and I really don't doubt your assessment, then it seems to me that that original 1.6 million number was hopefully optimistic in the first place.
Is it possible, Andrew, to give us a summary of some of the reasons why this viability calculation has changed so dramatically in such a short period of time? I don't expect detail, but just a flavour.
Yes, I think probably one of the most relevant factors is that we did start considering viability as part of the last application, and it was not, we weren't able to kind of progress that to a point where there was suitable agreement. I think at that point on the last application, the applicant was willing to put forth policy compliant contributions. So the viability in that sense, at that point in time, it was set aside. So we didn't get to a point, as you'll see from, I think it's Appendix 4 in my attached to my report. The full report there is from last time, and there isn't much in there in terms of viability at all because that was set aside effectively. The applicant put forth the contribution, which was policy compliant, and as planners, if we're faced with that, and that's the submission by the applicant, then it's policy compliant from that day, and that was what was considered. Now it's been reassessed, and we're in the position we're in. So without going into the kind of technical detail, which I'm not really kind of professionally qualified to do because it's a separate kind of valuer issue, it's clear it's unviable.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions at this point, David? Okay, Wayne?
I would agree on the site in terms of what we can actually deal with this evening, but there's a couple of things really. I kind of got my bearings wrong on this site, hence the conversation earlier, Andrew. I thought it was the other side of the 4 Millgate homes, but it's actually the same site. And I would put it to the group that the only reason why they agreed to be policy compliant before was so in principle they get a decision of approval, knowing that it wasn't compliant in the first place. But they know once they've got the compliant, it was in principally based on everything else, they got it over the line, knowing that if they come back again, it's a lot easier. But let's just have a review of where this is. This is one of the most expensive parts of Berkshire, not Wokingham, Berkshire. And if you can't make this site viable here, I think every builder in the country might as well give up and go home. The only reason why this isn't compliant is because they pay too much for the damn land. It's obvious. It's basic economics. You don't have to be the best QS in the world to work this out. And I think it's an absolute nightmare that we're taking from 1.6 million down to £100,000. And the guy, the agent speaking, was almost like, You should be lucky with 100,000. It's absolutely, and I won't be supporting it. I'm sorry. I think to build those houses on that location, right next to Sunrise, the most expensive care home, as I believe, what is it, £2,500 to £3,000 a week for a room. Next to the 4 houses, one of them's on the market at the moment for about 1.8 million. This site is viable. I think they should go back and do their homework.
Thank you, Councillor Smith. Are there any other members who would like to ask questions? To make comments? Okay, David, and then I would like to ask a question, and Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just reflecting Councillor Smith's point there, that if this original application was approved with the Section 106 money being at the level that is indicated, the 40% level, and it clearly wasn't viable even at that level, then it is unlikely, in my view, that a previous application would have been passed by the committee. Now, I know we're judging the application that's in front of us, not a past one, but it does seem to be that we're at risk of creating a great loophole here that any future applicant can put in any kind of number they wish in terms of the social contribution, knowing that if all else is then accepted, it can then be negotiated down later. And I think that would be a very unfortunate precedent for us to set.
Thank you for that, David. I'd like to ask 2 questions, and then Wayne, and then Chris. Stephen and Chris, sorry. Yeah, the first matter that I'd like to just clarify and probe a little bit is the relationship between this application and the extant permission. And in particular, whether refusal of this application would stop the applicant from proceeding with the extant permission. The extant permission, which includes a Section 106 agreement worth £1.6 million. So that's the first point that I would like to ask about. Perhaps I could have an answer to that, because the second question is slightly different.
Sorry, could you let's do that again.
Okay, so we've there's an extant permission on this site. Okay, and that permission included a provision, a Section 106 agreement that would pay £1.6 million to WBC for the provision of affordable housing. So my question is, what is the relationship between this application and the extant permission, and in particular, whether refusal of this application would stop the applicant from proceeding with the extant permission with the payment of the 1.6 million for affordable housing?
Okay, thank you, Chair. No, they're independent of each other. So they have permission to build out. If they decide to build out the extant scheme, then the obligations are due in terms of the contributions. So this is not related to the new application that we're considering.
Certainly, Brian. Yeah.
The original the granted planning permission in 2021, it remains extant. The applicant is at liberty to implement should they wish, as Andrew just said, and then obviously the obligations would be required. If the site, imagine this application is not before us and we are simply dealing with the 2021 scheme, if that scheme remains unviable, or it is now unviable, then in essence, the option for the developer to proceed with that scheme is at their own risk. It possibly would sterilise the site for them, and then possibly alternative development. They'd be at liberty to seek any other alternative development via planning permission. This application is independent. This being refused would not in any way affect the options that the applicant has on the previous permission. And there's a kind of wider discussion over the refusal of any permission based on failure to provide affordable housing, but that can be covered later.
So just for clarification, there are a few small changes to the application before us tonight compared to the previous application. There is, of course, the big change with regards to Section 106. If the applicant was to choose to build out with the the extant permission, according to the terms of that extant permission, would they then be able to request a new viability statement assessment based on the previous application? No. Okay. Right, thank you. I want to pursue this just a little bit further because I do have a lot of sympathy for what Councillor Smith and Cornish have said. On page 38, it's stated that paragraph 57C of the MPPF states that one of the tests which must be fairly met for planning obligations to be sought is that it be fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development. Now, I believe it's reasonable to assume that the affordable housing requirements are intended to apply in all but exceptional circumstances. Can officers advise on whether the large scale of this development, 57 dwellings, is in planning law a material consideration when applying the viability test, whether the nature of the dwellings, senior living in 3 blocks versus individual dwellings, each on its own plot, is also relevant consideration? I ask this because it seems to me that the likelihood of securing minimal affordable housing under the new application would have a considerable reduction in impact in terms of the stock of new affordable housing in our borough, and that there could be an important principle of fairness at stake here. Is it really intended that some designs for dwellings should avoid or have significantly reduced contributions towards affordable housing that are compulsory and paid for others?
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair. I think it's probably worth reminding ourselves that the MPPF sets out quite clearly the expectations on local authorities and on developers, that where we have policies that set out contributions for affordable housing, development should be expected to comply with them. That's the starting point. In our case, it's 40% affordable housing, and those sites that do comply with them, as is the case in the previous planning permission, they are to be assumed to be viable. So again, providing landscape and providing parking, whether the development can afford or it's viable for the development to provide it, it is part of the package. Okay, so we don't break apart what a developer can or cannot afford to do. It's viewed holistically. Affordable housing, when it's baked into policy as it is in Wokingham, deals with that in the same way. It is up to the developer, the applicant, to demonstrate to us as the local authority whether there are any other circumstances that they should take into account that would dictate a lower or reduced or zero level of affordable housing, the same way as a developer could not provide parking unless they provided exceptional circumstances why it wasn't appropriate. So in taking that forward, in this case, the previous application was policy compliant. This application is not policy compliant, but the MPPF sets out clearly that it is up to us as the decision makers to afford the necessary weight to those conclusions. If we ignore the conclusions, for example, of a financial viability appraisal, and we insist that a site needs to provide policy compliant affordable housing, the developer will not develop the site. It will remain undeveloped. Regardless of whether it is residential, market residential, or whether it is C2, C3, or any other type of development, there isn't a distinction within our policy unless it doesn't qualify because it's below a threshold. In this case, it is 57 units. That qualifies. Therefore, the policy kicks in, 40% required as a starting point. The considerations which dictate that they can't be provided is financial viability. That has been independently verified, and we end up with our conclusion now. There is nothing stopping the previous application from taking the same route if the economic conditions in July 21 were as bad or as unpredictable as they are now. Now, as we all know, no one knows what's going to happen next week, let alone 6 months' time. And right now, a year and a half is quite a long time economically. So for us to conclude that something can or is viable when we don't have the evidence, as Councillor Conway rightly made reference to at the beginning, is not necessarily that prudent. Does that assist?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Stephen and then Chris. Thank you.
I really wanted to just bring us back to what would happen if the committee went down the route that it would like to go down. And I share that desire. No one is more committed to affordable housing in this room than I am, but we do have to accept that we've had now an expert testimony that suggests that on viability terms, this site could not provide the level of affordable housing that was agreed on the previous application. We have to ask ourselves what would happen at appeal if we refuse this, and that's a really material consideration. And I do not think we would have a leg to stand on, to be quite frank.
Thank you, Stephen. Chris?
Well, it's more or less the same. Stephen said the same thing twice, so more or less going to say the same, but I do sympathise with the points that members have made. I think that what's really happening is that they're really asking for a change of policy here, and we can't change policy on the planning committee. We have to deal with policy and procedures laid down. This planning application is really in two halves. The first half is the outline application itself, which is almost exactly the same as the one that has consent. No one has suggested that we refused it on that basis, that the new one is different, or circumstances have changed, or policies changed. Nothing seems to have changed. So I think that's straightforward. It should be approved. So the only question is the viability question. And that's, unfortunately, is a black box to us. We can't see what's going on. And I can't see what we can do other than go along with the recommendations, whatever they are. And £100,000 is a very disappointing figure. But I think we have to, unfortunately, we have to accept it. Otherwise, as Stephen said, we would lose at appeal.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any other members who would like to comment or to ask questions? Wayne?
I still don't agree. I mean, I understand what Stephen's saying, but this is 57 houses in a prime location in Berkshire, and it's not viable. Just think about those words. 57 houses in one of the most expensive areas of Berkshire, and it's not viable. And we're going to allow them to build 57 houses with no provision of affordable housing. I don't like commuted sums in the first place because it's a get out. We're letting them get away with £100,000. It's ridiculous.
Thank you for expressing that view, Wayne. Anybody else? David?
I mean, we can't probe into what Chris referred to as the black box of the financial viability study. I understand that. But Councillor Smith caught my attention earlier on when he mentioned the possibility that the land had been purchased at too high a price. Now, we don't know that. But it does seem to me that if the financial assessment, the independent financial assessment, doesn't take that sort of thing into account, this is again creating a loophole of significant proportions for the future, because anyone can overpay for any piece of land and they can recoup the money later by not paying the social housing levy. Now, I've no means of proving whether that's correct or not, but it does seem to me that we've got a very large question mark in that area.
I don't want to repeat what everybody else has said, but I do want it to be clear that I feel this is a very dangerous precedent to set, that we would be going against policy moving forward. It's incredibly dangerous and how this figure has gone from where it was to where it is. For me, there's no clear explanation. So I would just like that noted.
Thank you, Rebecca. Al and then Stephen.
Well, I mean, if we're presented with a black box decision, I mean, sure, that's not good enough, really. Surely we should see we should have been shown some of these figures if we're to make a decision on them. So, I agree that £100,000 just sounds like chicken feed.
Brian?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Al, for that. The one thing I suppose the committee should be aware is that the £100,000 that we've been discussing during the debate is not it is not the total. It is a starting point. Bearing in mind that we have agreed with the developer a late stage deferred payment mechanism, which is the most appropriate tool available to recover any increase in value, whether there would be a change in build costs, variable land value, and so on. That is nationally supported, that approach, and it would allow us, if, for example, economic conditions were to improve in this country, in this region, in this county, or viability was to improve over the next foreseeable future, the council could recover contributions towards affordable housing. So the 100,000 is a starting point. It will only, if things improve, increase through the deferred payment mechanism.
Okay, Wayne, and then Chris, and then I'd like to draw this to a conclusion.
With all due respect, Brian, viability in this region, people can't get houses because there's not enough on the market. They can't get rented accommodation because there's not enough on the market. This area is very viable. And just doing pure maths on this site, and I wish I would have seen the calculation before, they must have spent a lot of money on those 3 houses on this site, because I'm working out here that they've got a surplus, because I reckon they're going to get 400,000 each for these places, minimum. Because you go around the corner into West Drive, they're selling for over 500 flats. It's just not right. And we can't keep saying, it's like saying, well, look, we're going to apply a rule from Durham and then we're going to apply a rule in Sonnet. It's not
Councillor
right.
Smith, I'm going to interrupt there. You've made your point very articulately, very strongly, okay, and it does have a lot of sympathy, within the room, okay. But so I'd like to just note that and then now move on. Okay, Stephen and then Chris.
I just really wanted to come back to the point about setting a really dangerous precedent that Rebecca mentioned. I fear the precedent's already set. This kind of thing has happened before, and I don't think we as a planning committee can solve this. This is something where we're going to have to reflect on whether there can be any policy change. Chris made the point earlier on that we as a planning committee have to operate within the rules that are set for us, and that's absolutely right. And we do have to have a mind to what would happen at appeal. So whatever our emotional feelings that this is wrong, I don't think we have much option but to approve this. And I think we do need, however, perhaps to, as a committee, request that the executive member for the local plan has a look at the planning policy framework around this and sees whether anything can be done to change it.
Thank you. I'll come back to that suggestion in just one moment. Chris?
Not strictly related to this application, I just wondered, is it policy in a similar situation always to allow the commuted sum to be increased if circumstances improve for the applicant in any development?
Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Burring. It's a deferred payment mechanism is a recognised way of recovering any increase in value for affordable housing. It's not specifically referenced in our policy, but it is supported nationally as an approach in the NPPF, and it is frequently used in locations where, for example, affordable housing is often not met, but market conditions might improve, and it is a useful mechanism for a council to claw back any increase in value.
Thank you for that important question, Chris, and also for your answer, Brian. Okay, in the absence of any further questions, I would like to call on a member to make a proposal on this application. So anybody who'd like to make a proposal? Chris? Thank you. Okay, subject to the conditions and informatives outlined, pages 41 to 50. Yeah, do we have a seconder? Okay, Stephen? Okay, those in favour of the recommendation for approval, please raise your hands. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Those against? And there are no abstentions.
Not carried.
So this proposal is not carried. Okay. Would a member like to make an alternative proposal?
Well, I think the alternative proposal is that we disagree with the fact that there will be no affordable stroke social housing attached to this site. And it's gone from 1.6 million to 100,000 in a market that hasn't gone down. This area, I live in RG10, this area has not seen any decrease in house prices. House prices are still going up.
Okay, Councillor Smith, can you come to your alternative proposal?
That was just a bit of information.
Thank
but
you.
As I said, because the prices, go back to the contribution. We don't see a reason for a contribution from 1.6 to 100,000, and the viability is on this site, and it could take social housing or commuted sums.
I have not detected a proposal.
Well, let's ask the officers then.
Stephen, before we come to Brian.
I'm not going to make a proposal because I think we're on a very sticky wicket with any proposal for refusal. Whatever reason for refusal, colleagues who voted against the officer recommendation wish to pursue, I would encourage them to try and take account of the fact that there's been expert testimony on the viability question. And they're going to have to take that into account in the way they frame their reason for refusal.
Brian?
Thank you, Vice Chair. I think it's worth just clarifying it is not necessarily a drop from 1.6 million to 100,000. It is in fact 1.6 to verified 1.3 below. So that is the swing. But the 100,000, as we've discussed and as clear in the agenda, is a contribution towards affordable housing from the developer at their own risk. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily have to be there. That is being put on the table, but it is not disproportionate to the overall scheme. And as the report makes clear, it's relevant to the scale of the scheme. So in starting from the point that it is verified as being negative by considerably more than we're discussing the 100, irrespective of the exact figures, the implications, if we were to, as a council, refuse the application on failure to provide affordable housing, the appeal would centre solely on whether the applicant can demonstrate viability or not. They have already provided that, and they will do so again at appeal. It won't be on the planning merits. It will be on, is the scheme viable or not? Even if it's viable, unviable by 500,000, much less than the 1.3, it is still unviable. And so their starting point would be unable to meet policy compliant, which again, national policy and our own policies allows a developer to, in exceptional circumstances, show the books to show that it's unviable. So it won't necessarily be a complex appeal, but it will be a single issue appeal. And there's a risk, as has already been highlighted tonight.
Thank you for that explanation, Brian. I'd like to come to Stephen first, if that's okay, David.
May I suggest that we're in limbo at the moment? There's been a rejection of the officer recommendation for approval, but there hasn't been a proposal for refusal. So can I propose, in the void that we're now facing, that we defer this application for further information to be obtained from the applicant on this question of viability?
Thank you for that. Do we have a seconder? Sorry?
Something with Mary quickly.
Absolutely. Mary?
Mary, can I just clarify something?
Yes.
Now the Constitution's fairly clear that when a motion to approve has been defeated, that it cannot be proposed again. Would that be the case if this was deferred and came back to a subsequent meeting?
No, because the deferral will allow different material considerations for the committee to consider, and in that case they can make, they can vote to approve after all in light of that additional information. In other words, the vote this evening is on what's before them at this moment in time.
Thank you for that, Mary. Okay, so we do have a proposal from Councillor Conway, okay, to defer this application. Do we have a seconder? Thank you, Rebecca. Those in favour of deferring the application? Thank you. Those against? And abstaining? Thank you. 2 abstentions. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Just before we finally conclude this item, for clarity's sake, okay, I think it's important that we specify the reasons for the deferral. And Councillor Conway, if you could just summarise those.
The deferral is to enable us to obtain further information on viability from the applicant.
Thank you. Are you happy with that, Brian?
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Thank you, everybody. So we now move on to item 51, application 222516, cherry trees. And I believe the case officer is Tarek. Tarek, are you there? Thank you.
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes, thank you, Tarek.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. This presentation will address the householder application at Cherry Trees along Liming Hill Road in Wokenham. The scheme involves the erection of a 2-storey side extension and raising the roof to create habitable accommodation following the demolition of the existing double garage, and also involves changes to fenestration. Here is an aerial image and block plan of the application site. The property itself is a detached bungalow, and the surrounding area is mainly characterised by 2-storey detached dwellings, all of which vary in architectural style and design. This application was brought to committee following a number of objections received from neighbouring properties to the rear of the application site. The main concern that was raised is in relation to the new first floor rear bedroom windows, which are outlined in red, you can see my cursor, within the new 2-storey side extension. The neighbours along Dorset Way believe that these new windows would overlook their rear garden spaces and therefore cause an unacceptable loss of privacy. Now, Principle R15 within the Council's Borough Design Guide advises that there should be a minimum back-to-back separation distance of 22 metres to avoid unacceptable overlooking and maintain privacy. The proposed first floor rear bedroom windows would be positioned approximately 23.5 metres from the rear of number 51 Dorset Way, approximately 27 metres from the rear of number 53 Dorset Way, and approximately 35 metres from the rear of number 55 Dorset Way, therefore exceeding the minimum separation distance as advised in the Borough Design Guide. It should be noted that the application property sits at a slightly higher ground level than properties along Dorset Way. However, this difference in ground level is limited to approximately 1.5 metres. In this instance, any elevated views would be directed towards the far rear garden area of number 51 Dorset Way, rather than the usable area of amenity space being the patio area. In any case, some degree of overlooking into neighbouring garden spaces is a common feature in residential areas. Taking into account the separation distance that would be maintained, the proposed first floor rear bedroom windows would not cause any significant harm to the private amenity spaces of occupiers along Dorset Way. Overall, the proposed development is considered to be acceptable on character, neighbouring amenity, trees and landscape, ecology, and highway grounds. As such, conditional approval is recommended. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tarek. Now, before calling speakers, I need to explain the following. Yesterday, I was approached by Callum, who received a request from residents to be granted an extension to the amount of time allowed for their presentation. After considering the context of this request and officer advice, I've agreed that in this instance, that registered speakers will all be granted up to 5 minutes for their presentations. I asked officers to communicate this to all speakers in advance of the meeting. I stress this is not the norm, and it is not intended for this to become commonplace. However, there have been precedents, and in this instance, I believe that it is appropriate to proceed in this manner. So the first speaker is Robert Kelly, a resident. Good evening, Robert. Of course, yeah, of course. If you could just put the microphone on, thank you. Okay.
Right. Our aim is to show that this application does not meet many of the council's own core planning principles, and this is why we all object and are here in person tonight. To save time, I'll be referring to Cherry Trees as CT and Dorset Way as DW. CP11, as per Wokingham's core strategy, mandates that in case of residential extensions, they should not result in inappropriate increases in the scale or form, with the borough design guide also stating that alterations or extensions should be clearly subservient to the form and scale of the original building in most situations. Not the case with respect to this application. By virtue of its height, the raising of the roof would not be subservient. The submission document suggests that the proposed extensions are not inappropriate compared to other two-storey dwellings in the immediate area. But the two-storey dwellings on Limmerhill are properties that are on significantly larger plots, given that CT shares its equivalent plot with its sister bungalow. CT is therefore much closer to its rear boundary edge than these other properties. The initial planning application referenced 17506 for a house on the CT plot was refused and dismissed on appeal. Planning has already deemed it wrong to have a two-storey dwelling on this plot. The submission recognises that the distance to the boundary is not compliant. In terms of privacy, whilst 23.5 metres to 51 DW exceeds the minimum acceptable 22 metres for new developments, this is not a new development. And the guidelines clearly state that this may not be appropriate in a relation to existing properties, further advising that character and privacy need to be considered. For living accommodation on an upper floor, there is a requirement to provide a greater distance or to incorporate additional design features to minimise any harm caused by perceptions of loss of privacy. Furthermore, CP3 general principles for development mandate no detriment to the amenities of adjoining land users, including open spaces or occupiers and their quality of life. The DW properties have always enjoyed excellent levels of rear garden privacy, and the residents have no perception that they are overlooked. There is currently no direct line of sight to the rear garden of 51 DW from CT. While the submission document advises a line of sight from rear-facing windows in 53 DW to 51, this is oblique. To view 53 DW on their patio and vice versa would require physically leaning out of the window. Not the same as a rear-facing window from a two-storey CT that overlooks the entirety of the rear garden, despite what Tarek may have said, of 51 DW and the other DW properties. Internally at 51 DW, the change will be from total privacy in rear-facing rooms to a direct line of sight from CT. The submission recognises the higher elevation of CT, exacerbating the overlooking. CT would be more akin to 2.5 stories than 2 stories. To conclude, the planning submission seeks to apply the rules applicable to new developments and place lip service to provisions relating to existing properties. This runs counter to the balance that the guidelines require, which reflect Wokingham's published values with respect to customer first, treat everyone as an individual and see each situation through their eyes. There is no overarching public good, and 4 of the 5 adjoining properties impacted by this proposal have objected. Prioritising the desires of one household over 4 is not balance. I therefore ask the committee to reject this application for the reasons I've outlined.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We have Heather Paxton, the agent, and I believe, Heather, that you have a presentation.
I do, yes.
Okay. But Tarek, are you able to share the presentation?
Yes, I will. I'll be one moment.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me all right, at least?
Just wait until the presentation appears. Thank you. Okay.
Perfect. So I just want to firstly reiterate what Tarek said in the beginning about Limmer Hill Road is very much a secluded road, which is majority 2-storey houses. The pair of bungalows in question, one being Cherry Trees and the one next door, are very much the 2 properties only within that road, which haven't really been developed. We thought because of that reason, we put in pre-application advice in May 2021 to ensure that any development done to this property complied with local policies and Wokingham Borough Design Guide. As such, the application in question is really off the back of the information we received and the advice we got from that. One thing I would note from the comments, and one thing I've put on here, is that there was an impression that when those bungalows were built, they weren't allowed to be developed. As far as I can know, that's not true. There is an existing covenant that says that house can't actually have additional windows without full householder planning permission, but ultimately there is no restrictions on development of that site. If I have the next slide, please. One of the things that I think here is the 2-storey by definition. I think in the design that we've done here is the idea is to be sympathetic, because the raising of the roof here and acknowledged in Tarek's report is actually only raising the roof by 1.7 metres. And if I put that in context, that's not even the height of a normal internal door. So the actual overall height increase is not a lot compared to a traditional 2-storey extension, where you're looking at sort of internal ceiling heights of 2.4 metres and then a roof. That's not what that design is. That's essentially raising the roof enough to accommodate habitable accommodation on the first floor. If I could have the next slide, please. This is really just to reiterate that the only part of the house that's being raised is over the garage area and the part next to it in order to accommodate a staircase. I think one thing that I would say here is related to the residents' comment about inappropriate scale or form and subserviency. There is always exceptions to that, and that's acknowledged within the Borough Design Guide. Can I have the next slide, please? This is really reiterating Tarek's point. I think it's important that those separation distances are acknowledged. And I don't think I need to talk about that specifically more, because I think that's been sort of reiterated by Tarek enough. So my next slide, please. So an independent event, which I need to talk about because I think that's ultimately the issue that is been brought here, is an independent event was that the hedgerow in that picture was removed. And if you go on to the next slide. What that meant was the line of sight and the visibility was increased between 51 and Cherry Trees. But I'd like to make my point that this is not anything related to this planning application. This is an independent event which has happened on consultation between the residents of Cherry Trees and the neighbours behind them. One thing I would say is what the current residents of Cherry Trees are trying to do is those trees are actually going to be pleached. If you show the next slide, please. What that means is it will happen in the spring of next year because they're being told by the landscaper it's the best time to do it. The trees will actually all be branched together in order for those to grow. The species of tree that has been planted there will grow up to 3 meters high. Not only is that going to encourage wildlife to shelter, breed and hibernate there, it's actually going to improve the privacy line that currently exists between 51 and Cherry Trees. Next one, please. The main things that came out in those comments and what I think were the concerns were mainly privacy concerns, which I think at the moment, judging by that initial photograph I showed you, are already there. The residents of 51, being a 2-storey house, can overlook and see into Cherry Trees regardless. So in principle, one part of that house raising is not really increasing or decreasing a privacy issue, which is really there just by default of the developments, one happening in the other. There was.
Excuse me, Heather. I'm
Yeah.
afraid I have to ask you to end there, but thank
Okay.
you for your presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tarek, to put this picture of I think it was the rear looking, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Tarek, are you still there?
Tarek?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Could we get the presentation up again? And
can you just-
Councillor Mather would like to see a particular slide.
Yeah, there's a particular slide, a picture you showed. I think it's next one. Next one. Yeah, that's the one. Hopefully, yeah, if you could just leave that up, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Let me put my glasses on. Dear Chair and Planning Committee, thank you for giving us 5 minutes today. I'm here objecting to the application known as Cherry Trees. I'm supporting the residents of Dorset Way whose properties directly back onto Cherry Trees. When you look at a map or most pictures of this site, it's really difficult to understand the elevation here, and the positions of the bungalow and the 2-storey houses that are on Dorset Way. Actually, due to the rise of Limmer Hill and the location of Cherry Trees at the very crest of the hill, from the perspective of the properties in Dorset Way, the bungalow is, and this is according to Tarek, 1.25 or 2 meters higher. And this means, and when you stand in the back gardens, this means that the 1-storey bungalow dominates the skyline. All you can see already is the bungalow. That's all you can see, nothing else. The residents have quoted the relevant CP3A and CP11.4 items, and I think they're pertinent core policies relevant to this application. However, I want to say a few more things. Since the property is already dominating the skyline. The proposal to add a second floor to the existing bungalow is regarded by the residents of Dorset Way as very distressing. As well as the distress, the residents regard the application as considerably increasing the mass of the existing structure. The residents also believe that the application substantially increases the scale, form and footprint of the original building, and I agree with the assertions of the residents. After a discussion with Tarek, we had a slightly more technical discussion. I'm not a planning expert. However, we discussed the distances between the two properties. What was stated was that the property is closest, I think, 23.5 metres away from one of the Dorset Way properties, which exceeds the minimum of 22 metres, but that's only just. Now, if you include an additional 1.5 metres or 2 metres in height, and I don't really agree with that comment about 1.75 being 1.7 being the height of a doorway. This application, and this is following the discussion with Tarek, could be regarded as a 2.5 or 3-storey house, because it is already a lot higher than the properties. In the picture there, those properties are 2-storey properties and they look like bungalows. The reason being this bungalow is a lot higher than the other 2-storey houses which back onto it. Therefore, if this is regarded after the addition of a second story as a 2.5 or 3-storey house, this does not comply with the minimum requirement of 26 metres. In addition to the core policies, this is another example of a bungalow being converted into a 2-storey building, which I believe is a very bad precedent. The population is getting older. The population requires more single-storey accommodation, yet we are not building bungalows. We continue to convert bungalows into 2-storey buildings. The residents and myself hope you will reject this application and request that the householder reconsider their plans, and if they wish to continue expanding their property, that they consider a ground floor extension which is eminently achievable in this site. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, so we now go to members' questions. Stephen? David? Anybody else at this point like to register to ask a question? Thank you. Okay, so Stephen first, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to really pick up on some of the points that Adrian Mather was raising and had been raised earlier by Robert Kelly. Relating to the question of elevation of the site and how much that might factor into our consideration of the importance of distance. As Adrian said, the nearest property is beyond the distance that our guidelines strictly require, but only just. And if we take account of elevation, the impact is clearly going to be greater. So I would like some commentary, if we may, from Tarek on how he weighs the importance of the elevation of the site alongside the point about compliance, in this case, just with our guidelines, and whether that elevation factor might cancel out the narrow compliance. There's also an important point about how we classify this closed new dwelling as 2-storey at 2.5, and whether that has an impact on the distances required. And I would like, if Tarek could, for him to comment on those two points.
Yes, thank you, Tarek. So it's the impacts of ground elevation and also whether this is regarded as a 2 or 2.5 or 3-storey building. Have these been factored into the calculation of separation distances? Tarek.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so these were factored in. So the difference between the application property and the properties along Dorset Way in terms of ground levels is approximately 1.5 metres. However, given that the rear first floor bedroom windows would be positioned effectively 23.5 metres away from the furthest protruding section of number 51 Dorset Way in question, that shortfall would essentially be mitigated by the extra separation distance that's proposed, which is at approximately 1.5 metres above the recommended 22 metres. Also, again, 1.5 metres was considered to be a relatively modest difference in terms of height. So in this regard, I would still consider the property as a 2-storey dwelling rather than 2.5 or 3 stories high.
Stephen, would you like to pursue that line of query?
Thank you for that, Tarek. But can I get some clarity on the relationship in terms of the height of the proposed windows, which are the cause of the controversy, the window that would overlook the gardens, the height of that window compared with the ridge height of neighbouring properties?
Sure, so I'm able to get up my presentation again. So yeah, this is the 2 windows in question, and it's around, the head point level is around here where the individual and a member, someone will be standing essentially and will be able to see and offer views essentially, and the rear garden area. With any, it was considered that any views would be directed towards the far rear garden area of number 51 Dorset Way in question. It should be noted that there is an approximate 2.3 metre fence along the rear boundary or the rear common boundary. So any additional elevated views would be primarily directed towards the rear boundary or the rear far garden rear area along the application site rather than the patio area itself. I am able to get up a picture taken from the rear garden area of number 51 Dorset Way if you give me a moment.
Just while you're getting the picture ready, Tarek, I'm slightly confused as to why you think the overlooking would be at the end of the garden nearest the fence. I would have thought logically it would be into the garden and towards the patio area.
If I just jump in there, Councillor Conway, whilst Tarek brings up a particular photo. The area of garden which is closest to the application site is the end of the garden. The area most usable or that people commonly, frequently use, for example, for their sitting out patio, immediate amenity is directly outside the rear elevation, and that is the furthest away from the application site. One thing that I suppose is worth mentioning is the context and the prevailing character, which whilst it's mentioned in the report, it's probably worth mentioning when we discuss separation distances for 2-storey extensions or extensions to roofs. The prevailing character of the adjoining streets, not necessarily Limmerhill Road itself, but the newer housing surrounding Limmerhill Road, there are frequently back-to-back residential relationships below 22 metres, in some cases 18 metres, and the level of privacy commensurate with this area from side to side relationships back to back and the visibility into adjoining gardens within what is classed as a suburban environment is commensurate with that environment. And I think one of the things that's clear in the report is that there wouldn't be any greater or more significantly harmful level of overlooking caused by this development than would be found in the immediate area.
2 very quick responses, if I may. First, we're talking about separation distances between dwellings. Of course, when you take into account patio isn't in the dwelling, it's closer to the building. And when you take into account that, then clearly it's falling below the 22 metre mark. Obviously, the 22 metre mark is distance from dwelling to dwelling. It's also important to recognise that if you have an existing relationship where anyone acquiring a property can see what that relationship is, they take that into account when they decide to purchase. That is a very different situation from being in a property with a settled view that then dramatically changes. And that's, I think, why there is so much upset about this.
Thank you, Stephen. David?
Thank you, Chair. I'm picking up again on some of Councillor Conway's points. On page 109 of our meeting notes here, there is a comment recorded from the neighbours that the proposed development will set a precedent for similar development, particularly along the northwestern side of Limmerhill Road. And the officer comment says each planning application is assessed by its own merits and level of acceptability. But if we turn the page and look at paragraph 6 under character of the area, the officer report says it's a modest increase that will be acceptable in the context of taller two-storey properties along Limmerhill Road, i.e. there's a precedent for it. Now, either it stands alone and each application is assessed on its merits, or a precedent can be formed. But it seems to me those two comments are directly contradictory, and we have to decide which one of them we're going to follow. And I tend to share Councillor Conway's view that here we're looking at the existing situation as it stands, not one that is relevant 2 or 3 streets away. I'd like your sort of comeback on that. Secondly, on page 1112 of our report, where we talk about overlooking in paragraph 14, there is, towards the bottom of that paragraph, a comment, there is therefore a technical departure of 1.8 metres in the separation distance. What is a technical departure? It either meets the requirement or it does not, but I don't understand. I absolutely do not understand what technical departure means. And then thirdly, on page 113, and again, picking up Councillor Conway's point, the diagram that I'm looking at of cherry trees and the lines depicting the line of sight from the windows, that arrow points directly at number 51 Dorset Way. It's not just the back of the garden, it is quite clearly the whole of the garden. And I do think it questionable, to say the least, that council officers should determine what is the most usable area of amenity space in the garden. That is for the residents to decide. They may choose to relocate their patio to the back of the garden. And I do not think it is the policy of the council to determine which is a usable amenity within a garden space. I'd like your comments on those.
Yeah, Tarek, there's certainly at least one direct question there from Councillor Cornish, requesting an explanation of the phrase technical departure of 1.8 metres in terms of the separation distance. If we could perhaps deal with that first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair. If you just give me a Yeah, so Principle R16 within the Borough Design Guide requires a minimum rear garden depth of 11 metres. In this case, the rear garden, when measured from the new side extension to the rear common boundary shared with number 51 Dorset Way, would have a depth of approximately 9.2 metres. So there'd be a technical departure in the sense that there would be a 1.8 metre shortfall in separation distance from the common boundary shared with number 51 Dorset Way. However, given that this is a modest shortfall and the overall separation distance that would be proposed being 23.5 metres, on balance, the scheme is considered to be acceptable on neighbour grounds.
Okay, David?
But what you've just said, I think you said, is that therefore it breaches the Borough Design Guide. And the question would be to me, if this is deemed acceptable by 1.8 metres, at what distance would it be deemed unacceptable? There seems to be little point in having a guideline which sort of is infinitely flexible.
Rowan?
If I may, yeah, thank you, Councillor Cornish. I think in responding to that point, it's probably worth just reiterating the status of the Borough Design Guide. It is guidance. It isn't the prescriptive text of policy within the local plan. It is good practice guidelines which we would seek to achieve where relevant to the proposal. Now, minimum garden depth of 11 metres is often either completely impractical in inner urban areas or in maturer areas. But likewise, it does not necessarily reflect the existing situation across much of the borough. In this case, wherever you decide to take a rear garden depth from of this bungalow, which is quite a large footprint within quite a large plot, 8 metres or 9.2, I think, or 9.5, as Tarek said, falls short of what a prescriptive garden depth as a minimum we would seek if we were building a dwelling on this land now with our up-to-date standards. So there is a technical departure in that regard. But again, it is guidance. We have due regard to guidance. It is not determinative. None of these standards are. There may be examples where less than 22 metres back to back for a new residential relationship is appropriate. Likewise, there may be new residential relationships, new build dwellings where a greater distance would be sought because of individual site circumstances. So again, there is a vast degree of flexibility. And in this particular case, returning to your point about the prevailing character of Limmerhill Road, that is establishing to us context. And we can depart from established context where justification exists, but for us to insist upon standards which are not only greater or in excess than our guidelines, but are out of, for example, that are inconsistent with what what characterises the area, would need to be justified, and that's probably where I draw members' attention to.
Stephen, is your comment on or question on this particular point?
It's on a point that Brian's just raised.
Perfect.
I just wanted clarity on that. So I think because these are guidelines, the argument you've been using about garden distances, that same argument presumably would apply to distances back-to-back relationship. In certain circumstances, we may make the judgment that the separation distance needs to be bigger. And we would take into account the context of the particular setting. And here, I suppose this comes back to the point I was raising with Tarek earlier about how much weight we should attach to the height, the elevation, and whether that would be a justification for saying that in this case we require a bigger separation distance than technically the design guide requires. So we have 22 as the guideline suggested. This is 23.5. But because of the elevation, is it possible to make the argument that would be a sustainable argument that in those local circumstances, given the elevation, the guidelines would not apply? We could actually ask for a bigger separation distance.
And on this very same point, I note that one of the two unobscured windows overlooking the homes in Dorset Way would appear to be really rather large. You know, it's almost a full height window. Is that also a factor that would be considered when determining appropriate separation distances?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Councillor Conway. So in answering, Councillor, your question first, if the context of the area was such that it was fairly or much lower density, so for example, in a semi-rural environment, in a village where there are significant separation distances already, and we had a similar relationship to what we had here, then it may well be that the council comes to an alternative conclusion that a greater separation distance would be appropriate. In this case, we have examples of back-to-back relationships of dwellings, even front-to-front relationships, which are below our guidelines in this immediate area. The topography of the land, the nature of the window are all factors, but not one of them is overriding. And when we look at side-to-side relationships, as opposite in Dorset Way, and we take into account the established, expected, and existing levels of overlooking from upstairs bedroom windows, we're not talking about living room windows at ground floor. We're not talking about dining rooms or kitchens. You know, we're not talking about rooms where occupants will necessarily ordinarily spend the majority of their time. We're talking about upstairs bedroom windows. The majority, if not all, of the dwellings here will have some intervisibility into each other's gardens, as is commonplace on side-to-side and back-to-back relationships. This particular example, by introducing, I think it was 3 windows, of which, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tarek, how many of the windows were obscure glaze? Was it 2?
One of which will be obscure glaze, being the ensuite bathroom window.
So those windows that are not obscure glazed, what view would they be attaining? Would that be unreasonable? Would it be out of character? Would it be uncharacteristic for the area which all these dwellings exist? And that was what feeds into the analysis of the officer's conclusion.
Thank you, Brian. David, you did make 2 other comments when you were addressing Tarek. One was in relation to the use of arrows to indicate.
I was just, one of the things I try and do when looking at these is to see what's completely accurate and what isn't. And I do challenge the view set out in paragraph 16 on page 113 that says the back garden of number 51 will not be generally overlooked. I mean, it seems to me it's going to be overlooked in its entirety. Now, how material that is or is not is not a question, but I don't understand how we can say it's only partly overlooked, particularly from the photographs that Tarek showed us earlier.
Tarek or Brian?
Yep, the arrows were largely to illustrate the overall distance measured from the first floor rear windows all the way to the furthest protruding section of number 51 Dorset Way in that regard.
David?
Well, there seems to be little point in continuing the debate, but I mean, just for clarity, it is my understanding from these diagrams that the garden of number 51 will be entirely overlooked.
Okay, right. Thank you. Wayne, and then myself.
When I first looked at this a week ago, I couldn't actually work out what the issue was, but I can now see it. And if somebody had have asked me this a week ago, I would have said, I can't work it out. I think we need to go on a site visit. Because when you look at the point that the agent made, and yes, when you look at the substantial amount of the building, and I've just scaled the sizes off, some of it is an increase of about 2.5 metres. Some of it is around 1.7, and I wouldn't disagree that is the size of a door. But then when you take into account the drop of 1.5 metres, you're looking at about 8.5 over 7. Then the point that Tarek just made of the 4 metres up to the window, you then add 1.5 to that because of your ground levels, you're then up to 5.5. So you're already at height of 5.5 looking at the middle section of that window where, and I would argue the eye line is higher anyway. So I think we could talk about this all night, but I would be prepared to propose a site visit.
Okay, is there somebody who would like to second that?
Oh, sorry.
Rebecca? Okay, thank you. So again, we defer this application until, okay, sorry, subject to vote. Sorry. Okay, so we've had a proposer and a seconder, okay, to defer this application until we have a site visit, okay? All of those in favour of that proposal, please raise your hands. Thank you, that's unanimous. Thank you for that suggestion, Wayne. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Okay. So moving on to the final application for tonight, agenda item 52, application 222366, Winnersh Film Studios. And we have one speaker. Let me go to the officer first, Joanna. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Please bear with me whilst I try to share my screen. There we go. Okay, I think that's working. Good evening, members. This is application number 222366, land at 1100 Sirius and E2 building within Winnersh Triangle Business Park. The application seeks permission for permanent retention of stages 1 and 2, permitted under temporary planning permission 214183, and for the erection of a new virtual production soundstage 3, together with associated access, parking, landscaping, and infrastructure. The application is part retrospective given that the temporary scheme has been constructed. The application site is indicated here with a red outline. It lies south of A329M and north of Eskdale Road, within Winnersh Triangle Business Park, shown with a blue outline. Winnersh Triangle train station and park and ride facility are located further south. Winnersh Triangle Business Park is located within a core employment area where proposals resulting in expansion or intensification of employment uses are encouraged. The proposed use associated with film production would generate employment, and as such, the principle of development in this location is acceptable. This slide outlines the proposed scheme in the context of temporary permission. Buildings approved under temporary consent are marked here in purple and comprise sound stages 1 and 2, workshops 1 to 4, and workshops 5 to 8. The current scheme proposes to retain sound stages 1 and 2 and to erect visual production soundstage in place of the existing workshops 1 to 4. The current slide shows the existing sound stages 1 and 2 to be retained, the proposed soundstage 3, and the adjoining buildings E2 Manhattan Building to the west, and 1180 Jacobs Building to the east. Here we have views northeast from Eskdale Road. To the left we have E2 Building. To the right are sound stages 1 and 2. And the proposed soundstage 3 would be located in between workshops, in place of workshops shown in the photo. This slide shows views east from Eskdale Road, with Jacobs Building in the center, Sports Hub to the left of it, and sound stages 1 and 2 further to the left. Here we have views west from Eskdale Road, with sound stages 1 and 2 to the right, the proposed location of sound stages 3 further to the east, and E2 Manhattan Building in the background at the far end of Eskdale Road. And finally, the final photo shows views southwest from Eskdale Road, looking towards E2 Manhattan Building to the west, with Crown Plaza Hotel in the background. To the left is shown E820 Building, currently undergoing refurbishment. In the center of the photo are units C1 to C3, which the applicant intends to redevelop as part of the scheme. In summary, the site is located within a highly sustainable location with a variety of transport options available. The proposal integrates well with the surrounding area and would deliver significant economic benefits in terms of employment generation. It would also stimulate future development of a larger scale studio space that would seek to meet the identified need for studio space in the UK. Therefore, the application is recommended for approval, subject to conditions and completion of a Section 106 agreement. Members are also asked to authorise refusal in the event of Section 106 legal agreement not being completed within specified timescales. I would like to draw members' attention to the supplementary agenda, which includes additional consultation responses received after the officer report had been published, updated reference to sustainability document in condition 19, 2 additional conditions in response to Thames Water additional comments, that's condition 20, and in response to the points raised by Vice Chair earlier this week in relation to BREEAM rating. Additional informatives in response to comments received after the officer report had been published. Moreover, there has been a last-minute update to the proposed wording of condition 20, which 20, which was included in the supplementary agenda. The wording, as proposed initially, read, "No development shall be occupied until confirmation has been provided that," and there is a list of sub-points, bullet points listed. However, it is now proposed that the first line of that condition instead reads, "Prior to the toilet block and the welfare facilities located within the Security Centre hereby approved to be brought into use." The reason for this is that the condition deals with foul drainage, and the foul drainage would be relevant to the toilet block and welfare facilities only rather than the soundstage building. That's the reason for that last-minute correction. This is all in terms of the updates. Thank you, members, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. I'd now like to call Oliver Bell, the agent. Thank you.
Good evening, members. I'm delighted to be talking to you again today in respect of the latest phase of Stage 50's exciting proposals to deliver Winnersh Film Studios as part of a new creative quarter at Winnersh Triangle Business Park. This application follows the Planning Committee's resolution early this year to grant temporary planning permission for 2 sound stages and workshops at the 1100 and 1040 sites within the business park. Our proposals are submitted against the backdrop of the film and TV industry continuing to be one of the fastest growing sectors in the UK economy. The shortage of purpose-built studios and production support space does, however, remain a major issue. This is evidenced by the fact that in the short space of time since temporary planning permission was granted on the site, the sound stages have already been accommodated the shooting of a major international feature film and a high-end TV series, bringing significant economic benefits to the local area. This permanent application marks an important step in the establishment of Winnersh Film Studios, seeking the permanent retention of 2 temporary sound stages, whilst the existing temporary workshops will make way for the delivery of a new virtual production stage, which we understand will be the largest in Europe. To ensure a balanced spread of facilities across the studios, workshop space will be re-provided for within the 800 series building to the south of the site, which has recently been redeveloped for a separate planning approval. 50,000 square foot of office space within the E2 building to the west of the site will also continue to be available for incoming productions. The application before you today will create approximately 300 direct jobs, and Stage 50's overall plans will, subject to necessary planning approvals, have a potential to create 500 direct jobs in the film and TV production sector. The proposals will also generate substantial supply chain benefits, as has been seen through the recent productions taking place on site. This will range from patronage of local shops, restaurants and hotels to a demand for specialist services such as makeup artists and set creators. The proposals will therefore support a further 300 jobs initially and ultimately a further 500 jobs, a significant boost for the economy. Importantly, the proposals will also ensure biodiversity net gain and a policy compliant approach to renewable energy provision through the use of solar panels. Prior to the submission of the application, we met with Winnersh Parish Council and they have responded positively to the proposals. Furthermore, and unusually for a major development, no objection has been raised by any local residents. The committee report identifies that the proposals comply with all relevant policies of the development plan, but there are no objections from consultees and accordingly recommends that planning approval is given, a position we wholly support. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Just before we come to Stephen, I'd like to ask Joanna, just for clarification, in the supplementary agenda, condition 20, Okay. Were you saying that there has been a further change in the wording from what we see before us? And if so, could you please read it out verbally for us all again?
This is correct, Andrew.
Thank you.
The new proposed wording of the condition would be: prior to the toilet block and welfare facilities located within the security building hereby approved are brought into use, confirmation shall be provided that either foul water capacity exists off-site to serve the development, or a development and infrastructure phasing plan has been agreed with the local authority in consultation with Thames Water, or all foul water network upgrades required to accommodate the additional flows from the development have been completed.
Thank you, Joanna. Do any members have any questions at all about that? Anybody uncomfortable with it? Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Stephen?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I hope I'm not being presumptuous, but after two rather tortuous planning applications, this one looks relatively straightforward, and I'm hoping we will be able to come to a rapid conclusion. Joanna's report lays out very clearly why we should approve this application. This is a totally appropriate use in a core employment area. It will generate employment opportunities, benefits to the wider economy. The committee, when it received an earlier application relating to this site, granted temporary permission. That provided an opportunity to see whether this worked effectively. There clearly have not been problems. If there had been problems, we can be reasonably confident residents, the parish council and the local ward councillors would all be raising objections. None has done so. And in fact, the only reason only two of the three ward councillors have shown their approval of this is because the third one is chairman of this committee and wouldn't be able to do so. So I think we're in the position where I cannot see why we should have a prolonged debate on this. I'm hoping we will be able to move rapidly to a vote in favour of the officer recommendation.
Whilst I'm sure that there are many who share that sentiment, Stephen, I was a little bit concerned that Rebecca was looking rather mischievous, when you suggested.
Thinking I was prolonging things unnecessarily.
Right. On a serious note, though, I'd like to echo what Stephen said, about there being no objections, including from ward members. Indeed, two of the ward members, Councillor Bray and Fishwick, have emailed in specifically, to record their support, for this application. So, is there anybody who would like to ask any questions? Then I would like to ask a member to make a proposal. Okay, Councillor Conway.
I'll make the same proposal I made a moment ago, that we approve this application.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Smith. Okay. All of those in favour of approving this the application, the officer recommendation. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Right. Okay, so my understanding is that there are no preemptive site visits being scheduled.
Well, the only update would be that the
Yeah.
site visit agreed by members for the second application would be held on Friday, the 9th of December, 10 a.m. 10 o'clock, Friday the 9th.
Yeah. Okay, well, that concludes the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for your attendance and participation. Thank you.